Hey everybody, in this video we're going to talk about the async await syntax, and we're going to talk about it in a general sense, but specifically we're going to be looking at this Ionic application here whilst we use it. So the purpose of this video isn't to explain the concept of promises in general. We're specifically going to focus on the basics of async await. So if you don't already have a general understanding of promises and how asynchronous programming works, I'll try to link to some resources for that, but that's going to be important to understand for this video. So async await, it's been around for a little while now, but it's this new sort of syntax that you might see. It looks something like this here, where you might see functions with async before them, and you might also see things like await as well. And so the basic idea with async await is that it is an alternative way to handle promises. So it's basically just a simplified syntax for handling promises. And although it is simplified, it kind of does make things perhaps a little bit more confusing to understand at first, especially if you're very used to handling promises like this, where we have an explicit then handler, which says what to do once the promise resolves. But there is nothing special about async await promises. It is just normal promises. We're dealing with normal promises. It's just a different way to do it. So what we're going to do first is I have this alert controller that I'm using here to create an alert. And again, I'm doing this in the context of an Ionic and StencilJS application. So you might not be familiar with the exact sort of methods I'm using here if you're not using Ionic, but you should be able to get a sense of the general concept of what's going on here. We're just making a call to some kind of method that's returning us a promise, and then we want to do something with that promise. In this case, what we're doing is using the alert controller to create an alert, which happens asynchronously, so that's going to return us a promise, and then we want to display that promise by calling the present method on the alert that was created. So this is the standard way we would do this in this method here. We make a call to the alert controller, we create the alert, and then we display it once the promise resolves in our then handler. So let's just take a quick look at what that looks like. So I have the application being served here. If I click show alert, we get our alert pop up. So now what we want to do is convert this to use async await syntax. And again, I want to highlight that this is mostly just to, if you prefer this syntax, if you find it simpler, and generally it is a bit easier to write once you get used to it. But if you want, you can still use then, just as you normally do with promises. This isn't being deprecated or going away or anything. It's just that async await is a different way to do it. So what we're going to do is convert this to use the new async await syntax. So what we're going to do instead is we're going to call this alert async await method here. Now, instead of waiting for that promise to resolve and then having some code that runs when that happens, with the async await syntax, we kind of code in a more synchronous way. So almost in a line by line kind of way, as if everything is getting executed in that order. And so what we can do is we could say const alert, which is this bit here that we're actually creating now, this final result, that is going to equal. And so we want it to be the result of this alert controller.create. So what I'm going to do is just quickly copy that down here. So we're saying const alert equals this dot alert controller.create. Now this isn't going to work as it is right now because what this returns is a promise. And we don't want to store the result of the promise on alert. We want the value that the promise resolves with. So what we need to do in this case is add await. Now by adding this await keyword here, what we're saying is we want to wait for the result of this promise. And once this promise resolves, it's going to put the result of that promise, that resolved value, into this variable here, or in this constant rather. But you'll see here that my await keyword has a little red underline under it now. And it says that the await expression is only allowed within an async function. So if we want to use await, we need to do that inside of an async function. So all we need to do is just add async before our function name here, and that's going to allow us to use that. And so now all we need to do is we have that alert created now, so we can just call alert.present just as we were in this then handler, and that's going to display that alert in the same way as we were before. So let's just save that, and we'll also make sure to call this alert async await function instead, and we'll just see that that works. So we'll jump back into the browser again, and we'll click show alert, and you can see that we get that same alert again, but we're using the async await syntax instead. So this is a pretty small and simple example, and you could say probably this code here it's a little bit simpler, but it doesn't look to be like a huge benefit for using this over that, for example. But in more complex scenarios, perhaps where you're dealing with multiple promises resolving, by using the async await syntax, you can sort of greatly simplify the way your code looks, how big it is, how easy it is to follow if you do use this async await syntax. Now, one of the reasons I kind of avoid using it, and I guess I'm not entirely sure which method I prefer when kind of trying to teach beginners, I guess, about asynchronous programming, how asynchronous code works for synchronous code, which can be quite a confusing concept, and it's really, really important to understand. And it's that with this sort of standard promise syntax here, you can very explicitly see that we're saying, do this, and then do this. So there's that sort of implication that something is happening, then something else is happening, so we're waiting for it. Whereas this looks a little bit less, this looks like the sort of normal synchronous code, where we're saying, you know, run this, now we're running this. So it's a little bit less obvious that there's actually a asynchronous process happening that's going off somewhere, running some code in the background, coming back with a result, but it is a lot simpler. Now, before we finish this video, I do want to go through one more example, because I think this highlights how to use async await at a sort of basic level, but there is another important concept to understand, I think, and that's exactly how async functions behave. And so I've set up another example here where I've got getAuthorSync and getAuthorAsync, which is marked as an asynchronous function here. And both of them just return a simple string called Josh. So what we're going to do now is just in this component did load method. And again, if you're not familiar with StencilJS, this is basically just going to run when this component loads. So it's going to run right away without us doing anything. So first we're going to log out the value of getAuthorSync. So we're going to say console.log this.getAuthorSync. So I'm going to save that, and we are going to jump into the browser again. And you can see on the console here, we just get a simple value, a simple string here, and it just says Josh, which is probably what you would expect. So now let's try out our async function. So it's the exact same thing, except it's marked with async at the front. So let's call this.getAuthorAsync, save that, and we'll jump back into the browser. And you can see now, instead of just resolving, or rather returning Josh, it's returning a promise which resolves with Josh. And so this isn't actually probably the value we want, and instead it's a promise that contains that value. So what this means is that if we mark an async, if we mark a function as being async, even if we're not using await at all within that function, that whatever value that function returns is going to be wrapped in a promise. And this applies even if you're not returning a value at all, even if it's a void function, it's still going to return a promise that resolves with void, or resolves with nothing. So you might just want to do this, you just want to return a promise, mark it with async, you're done. You don't need to do what perhaps you would have done before, is you'd say return new promise, resolve, reject, and so on, and then wrap that in your promise and then resolve the value. All you need to do is just mark it as async. And so that might be all you want to do. You might just want to return it as a promise and then deal with that promise somewhere else. Or you could, for example, if we come up here and instead of just logging out this .getAuthorAsync, we can say console.log await this.getAuthorAsync, because we don't just want to log out the promise that's returned, we want to wait for that promise to resolve, and we want to log out that value that it's returning. And so since we're using await here, we're gonna have to mark our component did load as asynchronous. So we'll add async in front of that. We'll save that. We're still using get author async, but now if we go into the browser, you can see that we again get that simple string Josh, because we are returning a promise, but we are awaiting it, and then we're logging out that value. So we get the resolved promise value instead of the promise itself. So it's totally up to you to decide which syntax you prefer here. If you find this sort of syntax easier, especially as a beginner, if you're just getting into things, it's certainly fine to use. You don't lose anything by doing this. It's just that your code might be a bit perhaps longer. Maybe it'll look a little bit more sort of complex than it needs to, compared to if you were to use the async await syntax. Things could look a lot sort of neater and simpler. And I might actually just quickly show you an example of this in one of the tutorials that I wrote a little while ago now, but I updated it recently. So I had both examples. So I had the standard promise syntax and the async await syntax. And the async await syntax in this particular example was many times simpler. So let me just pull up that tutorial. So this is just a tutorial on storing photos taken with the camera API and then using the file system API to store those on iOS and Android. Not really relevant to this tutorial. But I just want to show you the example here. So this is the code that is set up for moving around that file, and just because of the way that the file system API works, there's a lot of calls to where we need to first take the photo and then read the file, and then we have to write the file, and then we have to make a call to get the URI of the file that we just wrote, which will then return us back what we need. So there's this sort of multi-level process of things we need to keep grabbing and waiting for the result of the previous thing. And that results in some code that looks like this, which is quite very heavily nested. You know, it's fine, it works, but it is a bit ugly to look at and probably a bit hard to follow. Whereas if you use the async await version, you can see here that it is a lot smaller, a lot simpler. And so each time we're just awaiting that promise instead of setting up all those nested then handlers. So if you are already familiar with promises, it is worth, I think, investigating using async await, and I think you'll have a better time coding overall if you do use it. But again, totally up to you. So yeah, I hope this video helped to explain the basics of async await. I hope it helped you a little bit. If you did like this video, do feel free to leave a like and subscribe, and I will see you on the next video.